So again, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Common Core 3.0, T for T on Cultural Humility. This webinar is being brought to you through a partnership with the Academy for Professional Excellence's Public Child Welfare Training Academy and the California Social Work Education Center, or CASWIC, as part of the Common Core 3.0 statewide curriculum for child welfare social workers. We're very fortunate to have with us today as our trainer, Dr. Wanjiro Gali. Wanjiro was born and raised in Kenya and came to San Diego in 1993 for graduate studies. She has a PhD in psychology with an emphasis in industrial and organizational psychology and has completed her 3,000 hours toward licensure. Wanjiro worked as a human resources professional for 4 years before following her passion of working with children and families. She worked for 4 years with 2 nonprofit organizations that served refugee and immigrant communities in City Heights in the San Diego County, where she supervised a unit that provided family self-sufficiency programs. She provided leadership trainings, community organizing support, and also advocated for the community. Wanjiro then joined the County of San Diego Child Welfare Services Agency as a protective services worker, where she worked for 8 years in investigations, continuing services, and pathways to well-being programs. Wanjiro became an independent contractor for PICTA in 2007, where she trained classes on the refugee and immigrant communities, intimate partner violence, and social work practice in a multicultural environment. She was also a practice coach for Imperial County and an SOP coach for Orange County, a role she continues to fill. Currently, Wanjiro is the program coordinator for PICTA's Cultural Responsiveness Academy. So I'd like to turn over the presentation now to Dr. Gali.
Thank you, Val, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. So before I get started on the content, I just wanted to share a situation that happened to me in the classroom while I was training a child welfare in a multicultural environment class. And I would like you to think about how you would have handled this situation as we progress through this webinar. I've changed some of the content to keep the confidentiality of the trainees. So here's the situation. There was a young male who was sharing that his wife was from Nigeria and that they had recently had a baby. So his mother-in-law traveled from Nigeria to visit and help them with the baby. The young man was sharing that this was the first time his mother-in-law had traveled to the U.S., and when she got to the airport, she was in awe by the size of the airport and all the different races of people she was seeing. The young man proceeded to tell the class what his mother-in-law said, and did so by imitating her accent and using the facial expressions and gestures she was making, and he was very dramatic in his presentation. The whole class burst into laughter after he was done demonstrating how his mother-in-law reacted. What would you do as a trainer? The interesting thing about this situation is that I cannot recall the context of how this conversation came up in the classroom. All I can remember is this part. Next slide. Let's begin with the purpose of this webinar. The statewide standardized core for new social workers is in the midst of being updated for full implementation in February of 2017. This revision was in response to a federal review item that found that California's current training of new social workers was not consistent nor fully standardized across the state. The California Social Worker Education Center, CASWEC, and the regional academy entities for training new workers began the revision process in summer of 2013. With a mandate to standardize all training and in conjunction with the emergence of new modalities of training, the standardized Common Core 3.0 will be a combination of e-learning, classroom skill building, and field activities that all new hires will begin to take in February 2017. For trainers, there will be several requirements and shifts in practice. To help trainers make the needed changes in delivering Common Core 3.0 training, the state is requiring trainers to take either classroom or e-learning in 3 subject matter areas that are major themes throughout all of Common Core 3.0. This webinar on cultural humility and discussion of how the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, is addressed in Common Core 3.0 is one of 3 e-learnings that is required for all trainers who will train any classroom module. The other 3 e-learning areas will be on trauma-informed practice and assessment, SDM, safety organized practice. Please consult your training academy on accessing these 2 other trainings. More information will also be sent to all trainers as these e-learnings become available. Additionally, there is a 1-day classroom training for all trainers on shifting from a primary lecture-driven class curricula to a facilitative-driven class curricula. Core 3.0 relies more on trainers to use facilitative skills rather than on lecture and presentation skills. It is critical that trainers have the expertise in a subject matter and have the skills that encourage critical thinking and problem solving for better retention and transfer of application of learning to the job. Consult with your academy on when such trainings will be offered in your area. Next slide. And Val, just so I can interrupt, I can hear a lot of background noise. I'm not sure if it's only me or...
Yeah, I had put a prompt in the text to ask people to please put their phones on mute.
Okay.
Sounds like somebody has their phone unmuted, and that might be the background noise we're hearing.
Okay. So now let's look at the learning objectives. The learning objectives of the webinar include defining cultural humility and its application to child welfare practice, opening the discussion of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and culture with the family, and recognize the importance of ICWA and how it plays an important role in all areas of child welfare practice, and promoting cultural humility in the workforce. Next slide. As trainers, being able to value appreciative inquiry and exploration with the trainees so that they in turn can model their behaviors with their families and value the family's relationships and natural supports already in place. At the same time, always addressing any safety concerns in a culturally responsive manner. This includes bringing awareness to the trainees on how their own values and personal beliefs can influence the outcomes of the case and impact the lives of the families. How the trainees seek to uncover limitations and biases, and how the practice of self-correction and reflection is part of the skill set of staff in child welfare. As trainers, it's also a stretch for some of us to practice the concept of cultural humility in the classroom, and some of us are better than others. Going back to my example of what happened to me in the classroom, how prepared are we as trainers to address these situations? Would our first reaction be to ignore what happened so as not to embarrass or shame the trainee, call the trainee a racist and admonish his actions, or use a culturally responsive approach? As a trainer, it's important to be aware of how you naturally respond to a crisis or conflict and how you approach major decisions, as this could impact your responses to the trainees. Are you a deer in the headlights kind of person and freeze before you react and need time to think through your response? You don't want to offend anyone and like to think through all possible scenarios as to why something happened. This could lead to missing a teachable moment, as an incident can happen and by the time you're ready to address it, the moment has passed. Or are you a come out of the gate swinging type of person and you like to address things head on and think about it later, which could also lead to a missed teachable moment for the class, as you may react too quickly before allowing for time to assess the situation. Something to think about on how to tackle the conversations in the classroom. As we move further into the webinar and discuss cultural humility, I'm hoping you will continue to think more about your personal reactions to incidents and how this may play out in the classroom. Next slide. Under the current version of Core 2.0, classroom subject matter was taught in silos. That is, trainers focused on the subject matter for that particular training and did not necessarily know how to help trainees make connections to other trainings taught in Core. Under 3.0, there are some classes in e-learning that are more subject matter based. However, the premise behind 3.0 is to weave in themes throughout for a more integrated approach in training new hires so that they can make the connections of how the material is interrelated in their practice in the field. I can relate to the benefits of this approach, having sat through Core 9 years ago and remember leaving with a big binder and a lot of information, however not really understanding how it applies to my day-to-day duties. Additionally, research, evidence-based practices, and paradigms have also been integrated. As trainers, we are considered subject matter experts, and we are expected to take the lead in the classroom and tell the trainees what they need to know in order to become great social workers in the field. So how do we make the shift from being the only experts in the classroom to creating a learning environment where all can share their experiences and we can all learn from each other? There are several parallel processes in play between the classroom experience and what social workers will be doing in the field, as we model for social workers what it looks like to include families in the discussion instead of telling them what they need to do. Facilitated discussion versus lecture. For more information on the structure of Core 3.0, you may consult either Academy staff or go to our webpage listed on the slide. The CALSWEC website is also listed as an additional resource. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, the two topics to be discussed are cultural humility and ICWA. Child welfare workers work with diverse families. Therefore, it's important that we train workers on best practices in engaging and working with all families, including those that are different from them. Another major theme that is highlighted throughout Core 3.0 is ICWA. ICWA continues to be applied unevenly in child welfare practice, even though it was passed in 1978. As required by the state, it is the intent that all trainers have some familiarity with ICWA and where components or themes about ICWA are in Core 3.0, so as to ensure that all ICWA eligible children receive services as required by the law. Next slide. Let's now look at the definition of cultural humility. A cultural humility perspective challenges us to learn from the people with whom we interact, reserve judgment, and bridge the cultural divide between our perspectives in order to facilitate well-being and promote improved quality of life. Such a perspective frees the observer from having to possess expert knowledge and in order to maintain knowledge-based power control and authority over matters about which diverse populations are far more knowledgeable. The practice of cultural humility was proposed by Melanie Tevelon and Jean-Marie Garcia, and in their own words stated that they realized the population in the United States is becoming more diverse, and the original training of healthcare providers that focused on cultural competence no longer made sense. In order to provide the best care for the patients, it became apparent that the physicians needed to shift the power balance between them and their patients and incorporate self-evaluation and self-critique in order to develop a balanced relationship between themselves and the patient. This puts the physician in a position of learning from the patient versus approaching the patients with a preconceived expectation of who the patient is. They added, it leads to developing mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic partnerships with communities on behalf of individuals and the defined populations. The practice of cultural humility translates to all other relationships between clients and providers, including social work. Next slide. In summary, cultural humility promotes a continuous engagement in self-reflection and self-critique as lifelong learners and reflective practitioners, checking the power imbalances that exist in the professional-client relationship, and mutual respect, partnership, and advocacy with communities on behalf of the clients served. Next slide. There is a shift away from cultural competence to cultural humility. We've all attended several cultural competency trainings, and although the information provided regarding a stereotype of a race or ethnicity could be valuable in some areas, it does not allow for the uniqueness we all possess and deprives us of the opportunity to learn from others on how they want to be defined. When we compare cultural humility and cultural competence, they appear to be polar opposites. Cultural humility practice includes individuals engaging in self-reflection and self-critique as lifelong learners, awareness of the power balance between the worker and the family, openness to learning from others and the knowledge that you cannot possibly know everything about others, and transcendence, which is the acceptance that there is something greater than self. That is, the appreciation that there is a bigger picture and the world is complex and dynamic, and there is not one simplistic view on who we are. Whereas cultural competence focuses on an overemphasis on shared group experiences, also known as stereotypes, it undervalues unique differences in individuals, and the worker is the expert on the client's culture. The main focus is on racial and ethnic groups that have a set of predictable traits. Therefore, when a worker feels they have the knowledge of these stereotypical traits, they may feel confident that they know all about the family and don't need to learn anything more. This creates a power shift between them and the family, since they have taken the role as the expert. Here's an example. If the worker meets an African-American single mother, they may assume the mother's poor supervision of the children is due to the lack of a male figure in the home, which is a stereotype that African-American males are not in their children's lives. And the worker may not ask for clarification on where the father is. However, if they ask the mother, they may find that the lack of supervision could be due to the mother feeling overwhelmed with an overactive child, which could happen to any mother, regardless of race. And the father may not be present because he is deployed. An example in the classroom may be when the trainer makes the assumption that trainees are all straight out of college and have little or no life experience on what to expect in the real world, and that they're coming from a purely academic background. This assumption may lead the trainer to using more of a lecture approach in the classroom, as they feel they need to provide information to the trainee so that they can be successful. However, the practice of cultural humility would be to embrace the fact that yes, the trainees may have academic experience. However, they also have individual unique experiences they're bringing into the classroom. When given the space to do so, the trainees can share both what they've learned in their personal and prior work experiences that they can use in their current role. By allowing them to share, models for them how this can be done when they're sitting in the family's living room and wanting to learn more from the family versus telling the family what they need in order to be successful, which also ties into trainers taking on more of a facilitative versus lecture role in the classroom. Next slide. Let's now look at the relationship between multiculturalism, intersectionality, and cultural humility. Multiculturalism is our experience with more than one culture. Culture goes beyond race and includes beliefs, values, customs, and language, to name a few. We mentioned earlier that the U.S. population is becoming more diverse, which is a reflection of the makeup of the families which embrace more than one culture. Intersectionality refers to individuals simultaneously occupying multiple positions in society, and this could affect their responses in different societal contexts. Cultural humility opens the door to understanding the many layers we all have and moves away from making assumptions based on the stereotypes that are easier to embrace. Next slide. Let's now look at the skills that come into play when practicing cultural humility. Active listening involves concentrating on what the person is saying and acknowledging their words using gestures to show that you are paying attention and interested in what they have to say. Reflecting involves demonstrating an understanding of what the person has said by clarifying with them the intended meaning of what they wanted to say. Reserving judgment involves listening to what is being said and withholding judgment. This requires a conscious effort to listen intently and appreciate where the speaker is coming from. This means not jumping to conclusion before the speaker has completed their thoughts and really making an effort to remain open to what is being said. Entering the trainee or client's world involves experiencing from the perspective of the trainee or client and being a part of their culture or cultural experience. Going back to my example of what I experienced in one of my trainings, I think about what I could have done differently. How could this have played out as a teachable moment? My natural reaction to conflict is to freeze, and it takes me a while to absorb what is going on and think about my next steps. And this is what happened in this situation. I was stunned by what was playing out before me and didn't do anything to address what I felt was a disrespectful portrayal of his mother-in-law. This incident bothered me so much during the rest of the training, and I wondered whether I should approach the trainee offline or let it go. I missed the teachable moment, and in hindsight, this is what I could have done differently. I believe I actively listened to what the trainee had said, as I was so absorbed in what he was saying, and thanked him for his input once he had completed sharing. I did not practice reflection by clarifying whether he was sharing the story to talk about how happy he was for his mother-in-law's help with their child, or was the purpose of his story to indicate the differences in culture between himself and his mother-in-law, and how he was impacted by her response to being in the U.S. I failed to reserve judgment, as when he was mimicking his mother-in-law, it triggered me. As being an immigrant with an accent and having been mimicked several times by others, I immediately felt that he disrespected his mother-in-law and was making fun of her, whereas this may not have been the case. He may actually find his mother-in-law's accent fascinating, and he may have innocently not realized the impact of how he was portraying her to others. I did not enter his world to see this from his unique experience and instead made an assumption about him based on my own experiences with others. So if I was to go back and revisit the scene, I would practice the mentioned skills. I would clarify with him what his intention was regarding sharing his experience, so that he could also be clear as to how he wanted information to be interpreted by others. I would give him feedback regarding my reaction to him mimicking his mother-in-law and explore the reasoning behind his decision to portraying her that way. And we can discuss how he may not have been aware of how he was coming across to me or others. I would have him explore what it feels like to be a new father and hosting his mother-in-law from a different culture. Using the skills of active listening, reflecting, reserving judgment, and entering into his world, guide the conversation so both he and I are clear and in agreement on the message he wanted to portray. The parallel process will show the trainees in the room that it is okay to slow down the conversation to get more clarity from the clients and create a space for the clients to express themselves without judgment, versus doing what I initially did, making assumptions based on stereotypes and filling in the blanks of what I think the intended message is, leaving with preconceived ideas about what the client meant impacts decisions made in the investigational case. I would also add that there will be moments in the classroom when opportunities will be missed, and as trainers, we are possibly not going to catch every single teachable moment. However, this incident made me aware that I need to be prepared to address situations in the classroom as they happen to the best of my ability. Think of a time when a trainee said something that didn't sit well with you and how you handled the situation. If you had to go back and reenact that scenario using culturally responsive skills and knowing you were modeling behavior that social workers could use with families, what would you have done differently? Practicing cultural humility should enhance social work practice, and workers should never lose sight of their responsibility for child safety, permanency, and well-being. Next slide. There is a handout on Multicultural Guidelines for communicating across differences that are adapted from the Multicultural tool created by Visions, Inc. I'll be summarizing 4 of the guidelines, and please refer to the handout for more information on the other guidelines. The handout is also used in the Fairness and Equity class. I statements work. Talk about your own experiences, as this allows you to be genuine in your examples, and it also models for others that this is a safe place for them to also share their own experiences. It is also important to refer to others that you were talking about by using their specific names or groups versus referring to them in generality, example them or someone. Intent and impact matter. Be aware that your good intentions may have a negative impact. Your classroom will be filled with people from various races, genders, and cultures, and there may be a chance that something you say may not land as you intended. Therefore, it's important to be aware and open to receiving feedback on how what you said impacted them, which is related to it's okay to disagree and not okay to blame, shame, or attack ourselves or others because of our differences. Just to give you an example, I was in a training when a trainee disagreed with a trainer's statement, and they argued for several minutes regarding who was correct. It was an uncomfortable situation for the rest of us to observe, and the interaction didn't really model for us how to handle difficult conversations when we disagree. This is a scenario that plays out often between social workers and family members. A better approach would have been for the trainer to acknowledge the trainee's input and guide the discussion towards embracing a different point of view. As trainers, I'm sure we can all think of at least one example when a trainee has disagreed or questioned our information. And I can speak for myself that it is challenging at times not to engage in an argument to prove my point. However, when I take the time to pause and listen, and remember we all have different experiences, it's easier to guide the conversation towards both of us understanding our perspectives versus taking it personally. It's okay to be uncomfortable. Learning from uncomfortable moments is an important part of this process, so pay attention to your feelings. Next slide. So where can the topics of cultural humility or discussion of bias be found in Common Core 3.0? Many e-learning and classroom curricula have learning points or activities that ask participants to think of families from a cultural humility perspective. The following list is not exhaustive of all mention of cultural humility, exploring bias, or providing services to diverse populations. There are also field activities, and while trainers will not be involved in the field activities, it's important for them to be aware of how they correspond to the block that they are teaching. In the foundation block, the topic of cultural humility will be weaved into the values and ethics class, the fairness and equity class, and there will be a cultural responsiveness field activity as well. In the engagement block, there will be an engagement skills e-learning, an engagement skills lab, and the topic will also be weaved into the 200 level interviewing with cultural humility one-day class. And there also will be a field activity that explores family, extended family, community, and tribal connections and relationships. Next slide. In the assessment block, we'll see cultural humility in the critical thinking and assessment class where there will be a bias activity. And in the 200 level, there'll be assessment knowledge and skill reinforcement lab class where there will be a case scenario and activity. And in the case planning and service delivery block, there will be a case planning in a team setting class, which also includes a case scenario activity. Next slide. In the monitoring and adapting block, we'll see it weaved into the managing the plan. Well, they'll be talking about supporting safety, permanency, and well-being, and addressing a personal bias activity. And in the transition block, there'll be a transition practice and also an activity that addresses cultural bias and ICWA guidelines. All the skills demonstrating cultural humility, that is active listening, reflecting, reserving judgment, and entering the trainee or client's world, can be demonstrated in all these topics. Therefore, when training these topics, it's important to keep the trainees focused on how they ensure the family's voice and perspective is paramount when engaging the family, assessing the investigation or case, and especially involving the family in case planning, while at the same time being flexible and open and always ensuring the safety, permanency, and well-being of the child remains the focus. Next slide. Now let's move on to the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA. The Indian Child Welfare Act is a federal law that seeks to keep American Indian children with American Indian families. Congress passed ICWA in 1978 in response to the alarming high number of Indian children being removed from their homes by both public and private agencies. The intent of Congress under ICWA is to protect the best interests of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families. ICWA sets federal requirements that apply to state child custody proceedings involving an Indian child who is a member of or eligible for membership in a federally recognized tribe. In 1978, Congress declared the part of its trust responsibility to Indian tribes, including protecting the best interest of American Indian children and promoting the stability and security of Indian tribes and families. ICWA is a remedial statute, meaning that it is intended to undo the historical trauma of Native children and their families by preventing the unwarranted breakup of Indian families by child welfare agencies, and when a child must be removed from the family, setting minimum standards that must be followed for identifying Indian children, providing services, and placing Indian children in culturally appropriate homes. Additionally, the ICWA provides assistance to tribes to provide the child and family service programs in furtherance of its trust responsibility. ICWA is intended to ensure the indiscriminate and biased interference with Indian families of the past does not reoccur. For years after the passage of ICWA, Native American children were continuing to be removed from their homes and tribes, and ICWA was not being enforced or complied with. Today, Native American children are disproportionately represented in child welfare. For this reason, the state is requiring trainers for Common Core to be familiar with the law, as well as where components of ICWA or ICWA practice tips can be found throughout Core 3.0. Trainers are expected to reinforce in their trainings any materials or case scenarios in which ICWA is a component. Next slide. Tribal sovereignty. ICWA defines an Indian tribe as an organized group or community of Indians recognized as eligible for services provided to Indians by the Secretary of Interior because of their status as Indians. It is a common misconception that the relationship between Indian tribes and the United States is based on race. It's not. It's a political relationship. The special relationship between the U.S. and Indian tribes is based on the tribe's status as a sovereign nation, which is why the federal government is able to treat Native American people differently than others and not violate constitutional rules relating to equal protection of the law. Indian tribes are politically and culturally distinct entities that maintain unique culture, language, and history. Tribal governments predate the Constitution and have long been viewed as distinct political entities that are limited by the Constitution, like the federal or state governments are. Independent of the United States government, they are subject to federal authority but retain their own inherent powers of self-government, including the authority to make and enforce laws, raise revenue, determine membership. The United States trust responsibility towards tribes is a legally enforceable obligation of the United States. Its obligations include, among other things, providing health care, education, and other services, and protecting tribal governments. The federal trust responsibility is afforded only to federally recognized Indian tribes. If a tribe is an unrecognized tribe, it means the federal government does not owe these obligations to that tribe. During the termination era, approximately 1954 to 1964, the federal government terminated its formal recognition of 109 Indian tribes. The terminated tribes' lands were withdrawn from the trust status, and federal criminal jurisdiction was passed to the states, and federal services provided to the tribes, including health care, education, and public safety, ended. A number of the tribes have been able to regain their federally recognized status. Currently there are approximately 50 unrecognized Indian tribes in California. Understanding tribal sovereignty allows individuals to see tribal leaders in the same way they would the leader of any other country. Such an understanding encourages respect and support for tribal leaders and the tribe's vision for their children and their nations, while providing a greater appreciation for their efforts to care for their own children. Gaining access to a Native American child is the same as if dealing with a child who was a native of Mexico. There are certain protocols that need to be followed to get access to the child. Next slide. Tribes exercise their sovereignty in a number of different ways with regard to child welfare. Many tribes offer prevention and rehabilitative services and have designated a representative, either an ICWA program manager or a tribal attorney, to receive notice of dependency proceedings involving Indian children. Tribes may also define criteria for expert witnesses, participate in permanency planning, including tribal customary adoption, and or assert jurisdiction and handle child dependency matters in their own courts. Tribes may approve tribal foster homes. They have the discretion to choose their level of involvement in the case, and if a tribe intervenes, the tribe is then party to the case and is legally entitled to the same rights as other parties to the case. The tribe may designate a representative to appear in court on their tribe's behalf, or if they are geographically too far away, may participate by phone. It's important to note that parents cannot waive a tribe's right to participate in an ICWA case. Next slide. Next slide.
Wanjiro, are you not seeing
Yeah.
that we switched?
I'm sorry?
We're on the correct slide, right? Tips for social workers?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, mine is not switching for some reason. Is it switched?
Yeah, we've gone ahead and switched. So if you want to go ahead and continue with the presentation, I'll just make sure that we're switched. There might be an internet connection on your end or something causing it. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's okay. There it is. I see it.
Okay. Great.
Sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. So tips for social workers regarding ICWA best practice. It is best practice to engage with ICWA representatives, social workers, and other advocates as early in the case as possible, as they can be an important resource in serving the families and in the decision-making process. Research demonstrates that keeping children connected to their extended families and tribes improves child welfare outcomes. And remember, even if the child's tribe does not intervene or assume jurisdiction, it is still an ICWA case. Therefore, best practice tips for social workers are to learn about the tribes in your county and state, to obtain a list of Indian Child Welfare Act agents for service of notice, communicate with the tribes as though you were contacting the governor's office of a neighboring state, meaning you show the same level of respect and adhere to the appropriate protocols as you're dealing with representatives of a sovereign nation, and respectfully consider what the tribe has to say. Otherwise, the tribe may decide to pursue legal avenues which could be timely and costly. If respect and courtesy is established early on in the relationship, there is a greater potential for collaboration on case options. The more options, the better chances for positive outcomes for Indian children. Attempt to resolve the case informally before having to resolve the case before a judge. Next slide. Where are ICWA components or practice tips found in Common Core 3.0? Again, many e-learning and classroom curricula have learning points or activities that ask participants to engage and ask families about their Indian heritage and understand the specifics of the application of ICWA once it has been established that the child is ICWA eligible. Additionally, while a child may not be eligible for ICWA, we encourage and support the spirit of ICWA to keep children with Indian heritage connected to their families and tribes. The following list is not exhaustive of all mention of ICWA or working with Native American families, but significant content can be found in this list. There are field activities mentioned, and while trainers will not be involved in the field activities, it's important for them to be aware of them, to be aware of the field activities that correspond to the block that they are teaching. So when we're looking at the foundation block, there's a focused training on ICWA, which can be found in the 100 level e-learning and 100 level classroom. Additionally, new social workers will attend a reinforcement of ICWA by attending another e-learning, and there will be an ICWA review and expert witnesses at the 200 level. The state and federal laws e-learning has a brief review of ICWA. In the Fairness and Equity classroom training, there's a discussion of disproportionality of African American and Native American children in child welfare system. ICWA is mentioned as part of the legal procedures e-learning. There is an activity as well in that class, the legal procedures, and there's also a field activity which includes ICWA and working with Native American tribes. Next slide. In the engagement block, cultural humility in the engagement block, there is cultural humility will be discussed in the child welfare interviews There will be ethnographic interviewing in the 200 level class, and there'll be a field activity exploring family, extended family, community and tribal connections and relationships. In the assessment block, during the SDM Skills Lab 100 level class, there will be a case scenario activity, and then assessing key issues in child welfare, there will also be another case scenario activity. And then in the case planning and service delivery block, there'll be an activity writing objectives and case planning in a team setting class. And in the monitoring and adapting block, there'll be, in the managing the plan class, there'll be a case scenario. And in the transition block, there will be an activity to address cultural bias and ICWA guidelines. Next slide. Each block foundation, which includes engagement, assessment, case planning, monitoring and adapting, and transition, will have the theme of cultural humility weaved throughout. In addition, there is a 200-level ICWA e-learning and a 200-level ethnographic interviewing course. Next slide. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. This would be the opportunity to ask Wanjiro any questions that you may have. You can either type your questions in the chat, or if you are on the phone, you could unmute your phone line and just ask some questions that way. And we'll start looking at the chat so that Wanjiro can answer the questions for you. And as Donna is saying, it would be very helpful to have this review to share with our ICWA trainers. Of course, we will also ask them to listen to the recorded webinar version of this webinar, and that's great, very helpful. Thank you so much. Also, I'm going to go ahead and add the files for you on the screen where you can download the two different things that Wanjiro was talking about. One is the slides from today, Cultural Humility and CC3 Trainer Webinar. And the other is the handout from the Multicultural Guidelines that was talked about in the Fairness and Equity class, I believe. I'll also be following up with the registrants for this live webinar with a follow-up email, and I'll include the PDF and the slides at that time as well, in case you have any problem downloading them. It looks like Lisa's typing something, so we'll just, again, give you folks a chance to give us any questions, or thank you very much, Wanjiro. I think everybody enjoyed this webinar very much and learned quite a bit from it. Okay, and yeah, Donna says it would be great for us to send the download button. Yeah, you actually, if you click on it, on the item, and then click download file, try that. But I will be sending them out, like I said. And thank you, Tanya. So if we don't have any other questions from anyone, I'm going to just thank you all for your participation.